5.
Well, what's up, Buttercup? You come here often? We do. You can find us here every week, as a matter of fact, here at Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we just sit around hanging out in the middle of the studio as usual, challenging conventional thought. We are your hosts, Sarah Jones
and Samantha Carter.
We're super happy that you're back once again, or once, period, to join us for yet another weird story. This week we've got one that we've been dying to talk about, and we've had a few requests for this one, so hopefully we can please a few listeners by sinking our teeth into the subject this week. But before we go there, we must go here. Don't forget to press the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from, and please rate and review the show as well. It's really super important and it helps us out a whole bunch. If you're interested in another way to help out the show, I have a really easy one for you. Just tell people about us. If you can, think of anyone who might like to listen, let them know that we're here and send them our way. We would really appreciate it.
And we're going to give you a great opportunity and reason to do just that. It's been a hot minute since we've done any contests, so we're going to recommend us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and we'll enter your name into a drawing for a fancy schmancy Bigfoot for Breakfast tumbler with glitter. Make sure you tag us in your recommendations so that we see it. If you give us a review on a podcast platform as well, that will get you another entry, even if it's mean, hater.
We'll secretly call you a hater behind your back, but we'll still put your name in the drawing.
And we'll still send you glitter.
And probably a petty note.
All right, Peter Pettigrew, move forward.
Okay, woo. Now that boring yet important things are out of the way, let's move on to the subject at hand. The people that we'll be talking about today are dark. They're mysterious.
Not Liam Neeson.
According to witness accounts, they are emotionless and callous. Their very presence sparks an inexplicable fear in the people who interact with them, even the people who see them. In the late 90s, they took over pop culture for a while, and it was likely the first that the majority of people had even heard of them, even though they seem to have been hiding among us for much, much longer. That's right, folks. It's time to finally address the strongarm police of the extraterrestrial world. It's time to talk about the Men in Black.
Now, like we said, the subject of the Men in Black soared into popularity in the late 90s because obviously there was that little movie. Just little. It was just small. Just the one.
It was a blip.
And to hear stories about these people, or whatever they are, actually existing, would make a person think that the stories likely just stemmed from Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones' depiction of them being launched into pop culture. But that's just not the case. Stories about people being followed, tracked down, coerced, threatened, and worse after witnessing a UFO or encountering alien life have been around for quite a long time. We've talked about UFO abductions and sightings in the past, and things of that nature seem to happen to people from all walks of life. But the Men in Black encounters really seem to be isolated mainly to UFO researchers, research assistants, UFO and extraterrestrial authors, UFO abductees, and professed witnesses. They seem to have a keen interest in finding out what they know and making sure that they're keeping what they know quiet.
Shh. I had this picture in my head of a creepy guy kind of putting, their finger on someone's mouth all sloppy. Shh. Shh. You can't see that as a listener, but I was doing it.
For the record, it was very unattractive.
Maybe it was.
No, it was beautiful. It was gorgeous.
It wasn't beautiful. You know it. Interactions with the so-called Men in Black have been reported all over the world after an experience with UFOs or extraterrestrials, and the reporters most often report feeling threatened, receiving messages from the men via telepathy, and that the men seem to know much, much more about them than they ought to.
Telepathically.
They seem to exhibit a sort of omniscient air that's often very strange and intimidating. A lot of times they'll try to represent themselves as a person of authority, even going as far as to say they're from the government, specifically often the Air Force.
And they probably are.
Yeah, they could be. Sometimes they are described as unkempt and messy looking, and other people describe them as unrealistically clean and neat looking, perfectly groomed with not a wrinkle in their suit.
I make this look good.
They obviously don't have kids, because when you have kids, there are wrinkles everywhere in your life.
That is not untrue.
And everything's sticky.
Things are sticky.
In my house, they are.
And they smell weird.
Yeah.
Kids smell weird.
You're just not sure if you want to sniff anything. Ugh.
I try to make it a general rule not to just sniff things.
Sometimes I accidentally do, unwittingly. And then I'm like, I shouldn't have.
I learned my lesson about sniffing things without thinking about it during a search warrant.
Oh, that time when they were
Searching
looking
a
for
meth
cocaine
house.
and you were like, is this cocaine? And you went to go smell it to see.
It wasn't cocaine, it was meth.
Oh, well, that's...
I sniffed the white powder to find out what it was. Does it smell like meth?
Didn't someone smack you in the back of the head?
Yes.
Rookie. That's the greatest story
Please
ever.
tell me that didn't just happen. I'm like, well, it did. Yep, but it wasn't meth, in fact, and I didn't have to go home.
That's
I was fine. Things were fine.
Oh my gosh, it's fine. We're fine. That's still one of my favorite stories ever.
Some witnesses have reported an oddness in their stride, as though their hips don't move quite like a human's do, causing the men to almost appear to swivel at their torso as they walk, or exhibit sometimes a motion that resembles a rocking horse, or looking as though they are gliding across the ground.
I also read several stories. I don't know if you guys haven't read up on skinwalkers, you really should. But that's a super common element there too, is that rocking horse motion. They'll see like a wolf or some sort of animal, but it's walking in a rocking horse motion. Very odd. It's a skinwalker. Navajo legends and such. We'll do an episode on that too.
Did you just call me a hoe?
I mean, no.
Okay.
Moving on.
So this is something that was reported similarly in our Black-Eyed Children episode. Other things that are reported from Men in Black encounters that is also similar to Black-Eyed Children is the way they speak. Their speech is very direct and distinct. They speak eloquently, almost to the point that it isn't normal, and often misuse common words or phrases.
Like us.
When in Rome.
A writing by Peter Roitzvich, a PhD professor of folklore, called The Men in Black Experience and Tradition, Analogs with the Traditional Devil Hypothesis, that was published in the Journal of American Folklore, is one source of information that we have found particularly interesting. Although we use several sources for our show today, we use many ideas and facts from this journal and want to give it credit. Check it out if you're interested in some further reading. According to this article, there was a confidential correspondence sent out on February 15th of 1967 from the Pentagon to all intelligence command centers saying that should they encounter or apprehend any persons who are pretending to be military officers and intimidating UFO witnesses, the Office of Special Investigations was to be notified. So already that is suspicious, because why would there have even been a memo sent out about this, right? So obviously
It's a thing.
we start out with a small amount of proof that there was this at least happening, whether it was extraterrestrial or government related.
I would say that one of the earlier accounts of these encounters, that is pretty decently documented anyways, was that of Albert Bender. Bender was a pretty dang interesting guy, actually, and we'll give you a little backstory on him. According to the Bridgeport Library website, he was born and raised in Pennsylvania. When he turned 21, he entered the Air Force and served during World War II for a year as a dental technician. When he got out of the Air Force, a year later, he went home to his family and worked as a chief timekeeper at a manufacturing company.
So this sounds pretty normal, right? But Albert wasn't completely normal. He was kind of an eccentric fellow, and we love that. He had a small living area in the attic of his stepfather's home, and he kept about 20 clocks in it. The clocks were all chiming clocks, and the area would be blessed with different types of chiming about every 15 minutes, ringing out from Bender's apartment.
How could you do that?
I know, that's horrible. He was really into the supernatural, ghost stories, and witchcraft. And this wasn't totally abnormal for him, because the World War II time period really saw a rise in interest of these types of things. Luckily for him, the 40s was a time in which stories of UFO sightings really started gaining in popularity and momentum. Of course, he was really into this as well.
Of course, we know that UFO sightings had been going on for a very long time before the 40s, but magazines and newspaper publications were really taking off at this time, so the stories were spreading more readily and were more accessible to a wider variety and bigger number of interested people. People like Albert Bender. He got so into this that he started a group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952. And the group actually acquired a few reputable members. Eddie Rickenbacker was one of them, and he was a World War I flying ace, and later the CEO of Eastern Airlines. According to the Bridgeport Library, Albert Einstein was invited to become a member, but unfortunately he politely declined.
He wasn't a people person, Albert, from what I gather.
But that didn't stop Bender, obviously, because it wasn't long before the Bureau had over 600 members from all over the world. The group's purpose was the study of UFOs.
So this group got pretty big, at least bigger than a person would have expected, I guess. We read quite a bit about the International Flying Saucer Bureau, but we were unable to figure out how they recruited their members. Either way, it wasn't long before the Bureau developed a newsletter or a journal that they sent out quarterly to all of their members, and they called this journal the Space Review. Basically, it contained different stories of UFO sightings that had occurred and the different theories associated with the sightings. It sounds like they wanted to get people thinking about the phenomenon, and this way, they were able to get different perspectives from all over the world. Kind of cool, really.
Like Reddit.
Yeah, except like for the 40s.
Yeah. Things seemed to be going well at first. The Bureau was interesting, tying people together, getting people talking. Great. But the enthusiasm didn't last long. At least not for Albert Bender. Not long after the Bureau got started, Bender's life started getting a little weird. Or weirder than it already was. He started getting these phone calls that were super strange and didn't make any sense. Not long after that, he started getting really paranoid. He felt like he was being watched all the time. He claimed to be receiving these telepathic messages that he couldn't explain. One night in November of 1952, Bender seemed to pinpoint where this feeling was coming from. At least in that moment, there was a man who appeared to be watching him very closely. Albert reported that the man's eyes seemed to be glowing. On his way home that night, he was followed.
Another time, Albert claimed to have been spoken to telepathically once again. Only this time he was hypnotized and found himself levitating. On a few occasions, he even claimed that his attic apartment had randomly filled with a horrible smell. A smell that resembled strongly that of sulfur.
Who farted?
Well, that's a bad sign. That sulfur smell.
Demons.
That's a theory with this Men in Black situation. A lot of people think that it's more of a demon situation than an alien situation. I'm not sure I agree. But we're going to get into that in part 2. Have we discussed the fact that there's going to be a part 2?
No.
By the way, there's going to be a part 2.
Surprise!
And we're going to talk about that as well. In 1953, Bender had an idea. He was receiving these telepathic messages, so he could only assume that this was the way that the extraterrestrials communicated with one another and with humanity.
This is the way.
Do you know the way?
No.
If you do not know the way, you must pay with your life. How do you not know the way?
I don't know the way.
Anyway.
You can go your own way.
Go your own way. Sorry. I don't even care. In this quarterly newsletter, Bender sent out a request. He asked his fellow members of the International Flying Saucer Bureau to memorize a small paragraph that was written in the journal and set aside a moment at 6:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 15th, 1953, to stop what they're doing and all say the words that they had memorized silently in their heads in unison. The phrase read, quote, calling occupants of interplanetary craft that have been observing our planet Earth. We of IFSB wish to make contact with you. We are your friends. End quote. So they're all supposed to stop what they're doing, these guys from all over the world at this exact same time of day, and just silently say this quote in their heads. And this is why.
The idea of this was simple, but kind of smart. They were trying to use their simultaneous recitation.
Spit it out.
Recitation of the words along with concentration on a goal to get the message to extraterrestrials. March 15th, 1953, 6:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time came and went. And I'm sure that many of the members cooperated with Bender's request and did this. We can only assume so anyway, because from that time, Bender's life only became increasingly more complicated. The sulfur smell in his apartment just kept getting worse, and he was now reporting yellow mist appearing in his apartment that was unexplainable. He was receiving telepathic messages that seemed to be more threatening, telling him basically to keep his nose out of extraterrestrial business. And they don't have noses.
No, but he does. And he needs to back up with it, is what they're saying. We don't know that.
They don't have a nose.
That's not a fact.
It's inadequate.
Making things up.
Your faces are inadequate without your nose. He didn't seem to heed this advice, however, and went on to announce that the next journal to come would hold a startling revelation.
Ooh. In July of 1953, Bender received some unexpected visitors. Bender is reported as stating, quote, all of them were dressed in black clothes. They looked like clergymen, but they wore hats similar to the Homburg style, end quote. The men reportedly did not speak to Bender, but once again, communicated with him telepathically. They wanted him to quit writing about the UFOs in his publication that went out to his members. They took copies of the Space Review journal, and when they left, there was a mysterious yellow fog in the air, just like the one he had reported before, and once again, the smell of sulfur was present in the room. So his startling revelation was not going to happen.
Now, this stressed Bender out pretty bad. He didn't eat for a few days, and he was really scared. He didn't know what to do. These men and all of these occurrences in his life were enough to make a person nervous, but he had all of these members of the Bureau counting on him to lead them in furthering their agenda and learn more about the UFO phenomenon. There were some high hopes that they would be able to make contact with these beings that had been seen all over the world.
Bender was feeling super stressed out over all of this. He wasn't eating, and he was reportedly telling people that he was scared to death, as the mysterious people kept visiting him periodically. The word about what Bender was up to with his investigating and the resulting trouble it was causing him spread around town, and pretty soon a few articles were written about it in the local newspapers. We are guessing that this additional publicity probably didn't help.
Fake news.
According to the Bridgeport Library website, Bender is quoted in these articles describing the men to have been wearing dark suits, flashing credentials that made them appear authoritative. At first, the reporter thought that he meant that these men were from the United States government, but Bender disputed this years later, saying that the men he encountered were not of this earth.
We all know that everyone in the government is a reptilian, so he was both.
I was on Reddit the other day, and there was a meme or a small video of a guy who was sitting in a meeting. He looked really professional, and he had a microphone in front of him, and he kept doing like this lizard face. And so they were saying he was a reptilian, and one of the Redditors were like, let me introduce you to cocaine. It was so funny. I was dying.
That is funny. I love cocaine.
I'm a golden god.
I dig music.
I'm on drugs.
Technically, that was acid. Bender's troubles didn't end. The telepathic messages continued, along with terrible headaches, feelings of being followed, and then of course his random visitors warning him to stop his research. All of this proved to be too much for him, and it wasn't long before he announced the closing down of the International Flying Saucer Bureau for good. He did issue one final print of the Space Review journal for his members, in which he stated, quote, the mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. The source is already known, but any information about this is being withheld by orders from a higher source. We would like to print the full story in Space Review, but because of the nature of the information, we have been advised in a negative. We advise those engaged in saucer work to be very cautious. End quote.
Another former member of the Bureau, Gray Barker, later went on to write a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. He had served as the vice president of the Bureau, and he knew Albert Bender personally. This seems to have been where the term Men in Black first came into play. Albert Bender ended up leaving Bridgeport and moving to California, passing away in 2016 at the age of 94.
Oh, we just missed him. Almost all of the information that we obtained regarding this incident came from the website of the Bridgeport Library and History Center in articles written by Michael Bielawa, as this seemed to be the most detailed and researched account that we could find. In the article, Bielawa presents some good questions that had actually been on my mind as well. First, he asked, could events be explained by Albert Bender's mental state? It is speculated, and fairly we think, that maybe Albert Bender already had some mental health issues prior to even starting the Bureau. He had already been really obsessed with the paranormal and other unexplainable things before becoming interested in the flying saucer phenomenon. Had his paranoia and the telepathic messages he claimed to have been receiving just been a symptom of an underlying mental health problem, like schizophrenia, that was just progressing as time went on? I think that's a fair possibility.
I guess we would be more likely to believe this had Albert Bender's experience been isolated. Had there not been more experiences from other people and actual evidence of the existence of the Men in Black in the many years following. Most of the other people who encounter them having reported almost the exact same things. People from all over the world, from all walks of life, who are unconnected to one another, many with no history of having reported or been interested in things like this previously, and no progression of mental health problems afterward. I think that since it's an ongoing situation being talked about and reported, it's something that warrants more investigation, and it shouldn't just be written off as the simple ramblings of a possible mental illness.
In the article we mentioned earlier, written by Dr. Reutzvik for the Journal of American Folklore, we kind of like the way they put it. Quote, "One could easily interpret Albert K. Bender's Men in Black experience as a psychological drama resulting from a combination of his bizarre interests and the stress his close friends placed upon him to reveal his secret. Indeed, it would be hard to dispute this. The challenge to this view as a general interpretation of all Men in Black accounts stems from the fact that reliable witnesses who neither sleep in rooms with artificial bats and spiders nor hang pictures of vampires and werewolves on their walls also report encounters with Men in Black."
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
So let's move on to some of these other experiences. We started the show with the story of Albert Bender because the founding of the International Flying Saucer Bureau was pretty interesting, as it all seemed to be the first organized group of people trying to figure out what was going on with all of these claims, and even going so far as to try to communicate back with extraterrestrials.
Telepathically.
But there was another cool story that we found from even a few years before that.
According to an article on History.com, on June 27th of 1947, a man named Harold Daw was out on his boat with his son Charles and his dog in the Puget Sound doing a conservation mission. According to documents from the FBI vault, from which much of this information was obtained due to the large amount of subsequent interviews performed by the FBI, the men were looking for and clearing away loose logs that had been broken away from booms. They were sitting in the water near Maury Island, just off the eastern shore of Washington. All was quiet, but pretty soon Charles noticed something weird in the sky. He saw what has been described as 6 donut-shaped aircraft hovering in the air directly above his boat. He described the crafts as being 100 feet in diameter and circular in shape with a hole in the middle through which he was able to see the sky. On the outside wall of the craft, in the whole part of the ship, he was able to see that there were portholes.
The craft were hanging out only about a half a mile above them. Out of nowhere, one of the craft dropped nearly to Earth, almost 1,500 feet, and it appeared to be having trouble. One of the other aircraft came down and hovered next to the troubled one, and according to Dahl, it seemed to be communicating with it before returning to its original position in the sky.
Damn it, Moon.
Then suddenly, debris was flying at the men in the boat, pieces of metal. The boat was damaged terribly, as debris fell into the wheelhouse and also broke the spotlight. Charles jumped off the boat, running to shore to hide underneath some logs, and he was hit in the arm, causing injury, but he came out of the ordeal okay. The dog, who was present, however, was killed, as well as a seagull, as reported by Dahl. Reportedly, they threw the deceased dog overboard into the water after the incident.
An honorable burial, sea dog.
Burial at sea, like a true pirate.
Arf.
Arf. Arg.
Arg. Being on a conservation mission, Harold Dahl happened to have a camera with him. How often does that happen? He had enough time to snap a few photos of the flying objects before they were gone. After having them developed, because digital photos weren't even close to a thing back then, he took them straight to his supervisor at work. This guy's name was Fred Chrisman, and after seeing the photos, he felt like he still wasn't quite sure he believed the story, so he went on his own out to the site of the incident. According to FBI files, as he was also interviewed, he told the FBI that the damage to the boat was indeed present and pretty bad, and that there was a significant amount of strange rock and metal on the shore where Mr. Dahl said that this incident had taken place. Not only that, but while he was out there checking things out, I'll be damned if he didn't see a weird craft as well. He described the single aircraft that he saw to be just like what was described by Dahl.
But our story doesn't end there because this isn't about UFO incidents. Harold Dahl ended up with a visitor the very next morning after the encounter. A man in a black suit went with Dahl to a diner in the area as they visited. The strange man was able to describe to Dahl the incident, which is weird because this man wasn't even present. This freaked out Dahl, and he took it as proof that this strange man knew more about what was going on with these craft than Dahl would have expected him to. The strange dark man told Dahl that he needed to be quiet about what happened, telling him that bad things would happen if he continued to talk about it. But Harold Dahl and Fred Krisman didn't seem to care about that. They tried to speak with a magazine in Chicago trying to get them to print the story, even going so far as to send him fragments of the debris from the ship that they had gathered from the shore.
Not long after Harold Dahl's UFO sighting on the lake, there was another one in the same area. A pilot named Kenneth Arnold had reportedly seen a UFO while flying near Mount Rainier. Now, this story was widely publicized and caused quite a stir as Kenneth Arnold was a highly credible guy. So the story seemed like it would be true, where Harold Dahl was not well known at all and likely difficult to vet. The magazine in Chicago had heard of Kenneth Arnold's story and that he was credible, so they reached out to him to see if they could verify Dahl's story at all through him. Arnold spoke to the editor and then from there got in touch with a couple of A2 intelligence officers that he knew from the Army to see if they would be interested in investigating this. And they were. The officers' names were Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown. So a couple of weeks later, the Army investigators Davidson and Brown came out and spoke to Harold Dahl, performing an investigation of his claim. The meeting took place at the Winthrop Hotel in Tacoma, Washington, and included the two officers, Harold Dahl, Fred Crimson, and Kenneth Arnold, from what I can gather. While reading through the FBI documents, it seemed like there may have been a couple of other pilots involved in this meeting as well. Pilots from the area who had also seen strange aircraft in the sky around that time. But since the FBI blacks out a bunch of their reports, it was hard to tell if those extra men had just been spoken to or were actually present at the meeting in Tacoma.
Dahl told the entire story to the officers and nervously asked them to keep it confidential for a couple of weeks. The officers agreed. Dahl then asked them what they thought about the entire thing, and according to an FBI interview, Lieutenant Brown told him that they would like to take some of the metal fragments that they collected from the shore back to Hamilton Field.
According to the FBI documents, they went downstairs with Dahl to his vehicle, at which point he gave them the box of metal fragments that he had collected from the shore and claimed to be a part of the crashed aircraft.
The two officers discussed whether or not they should return to Hamilton Field that night or wait until the next morning. They were flying in a B-25 and it was to be used in an air show the following day. With that, they decided to go ahead and leave that night, and they departed around midnight. Strangely, the plane would catch fire in the air and endure a horrendous crash. So weird. It seems like that happens a lot. Harold Dahl and Fred Krisman were notified in their rooms at the Winthrop Hotel via telephone around 8 o'clock the next morning, and they were astounded and in total disbelief.
An official FBI report into the plane crash would state that there were actually no pieces of a spacecraft or aircraft on board at all, and that this part of the story had been fabricated by Dahl and the press.
Later that night, Dahl received a phone call from the Chicago Magazine editor. Remember the one who got all of these men acquainted in order to vet the story? The editor tells Dahl that he needs him to leave his home and call him from a payphone immediately. Dahl does just as he is told. The editor tells Dahl that the magazine office has been fielding calls from an anonymous person all night about the conversations being held in room 502 at the Winthrop Hotel, and that this caller knew everything that was being said inside of the room. The editor told Dahl about much of the conversation just to prove that he was telling the truth.
The magazine received another call the following day, and they again alerted Mr. Dahl to this. The caller told the magazine that one of the visitors who had come to see him in the Winthrop Hotel was flown to Alaska and that the B-25 plane had been shot down. It didn't just catch on fire. The person at the magazine who answered the call asked the caller what his agenda was with all of this information, to which the caller replied, quote, "Don't think I'm doing it for the newspapers. All I'm interested in is seeing that this information gets back to New Jersey."
Whatever that means.
Deep throat.
Yeah. FBI documents speculate that Dahl and Chrisman made the calls themselves in order to make the story seem more mysterious and credible so that they could sell it. The men denied making the calls.
The magazine editor from Chicago, whose name was Ray Palmer, did seem to find the Harold Dahl story interesting enough because he did go on to write a series of articles about it.
Both Dahl and his boss, Fred Chrisman, would go on later to tell people that it was all a hoax. The government investigation into the UFO incident labeled it a hoax as well after Dahl told them that they made the whole thing up. But what about the injured boy and the dead dog? This is just my speculation here, but if two men were going to get together and make up a weird story, wouldn't they have just put themselves together? Why would they both be willing to collaborate in a lie for no reason and make up the story of the photos that he showed to his boss and then have his boss making another trip in the story? I have a weird feeling that they only went back and said it was a hoax after the government started asking questions and they had been threatened. But what do I know? People call me crazy all the time. And I have to say, for the record, I also read that they recanted. They said that it was true and that they were intimidated into saying it was a hoax.
So they recanted their recant?
They recanted their recant.
So did they recant?
Yeah, they recant.
So, since Kenneth Arnold was involved in this, and he had a story of his own to tell, also that was separate and independent of Harold Dahl's story, we'll go ahead and give you the rundown on that too. As we've said before, Arnold was flying his plane near Mount Rainier. There was a missing plane that had gone down in the area. According to the spokesman review, the plane was a Marine C-46 transport plane and there was a $10,000 reward for finding the wreckage. He was flying along looking for the plane when he actually saw 9 flying objects flying at extremely high speeds and described their movements like saucers skipping on water. Arnold reported that the objects reflected a lot of sunlight, as that's what he noticed at first, the light coming off of them from the sun. According to Britannica.com, Arnold didn't mean that they were necessarily shaped like saucers, just that they moved this way. So the Washington newspaper reported them as flying saucers, which may have been where the term was initially developed. That wasn't really correct.
Supposedly Arnold did report this sighting when he got back to the base, and he didn't seem to be alarmed about it, as he thought that it was likely just something experimental that the military was doing. The military, however, did seem very confused by this. If it had been something experimental, they would have known about it, but they didn't. What was out there flying around? Arnold had reported to them that the planes or crafts he had seen had been flying around 1,200 miles per hour, which is way faster than the speed of sound. There's only one other thing at this time that could have been going that fast, and it was the V-2 rocket. And they didn't have any of those. Harold promptly went out and spent $150 on a brand new camera with a way bigger lens in case this ever happened again. His photo came under scrutiny, obviously. He didn't have a zoom lens, so in the end, the flying objects were a little far away and appeared basically as little dots in the photo. Many who didn't believe Arnold said that it was simply just dust on his lens. He didn't want to be called a liar again, and a $150 camera at that time was a pretty pricey one.
So, back to the Men in Black. Another seemingly credible encounter was that of Dr. Herbert Hopkins in Maine. He was collaborating with a man named David Stevens, who had encountered a UFO and had agreed to do a hypnotic regression on him as he did not remember what had happened.
I'm not sure how long after this job, but at some point he received a phone call at his home. The person on the other end told him that they were a UFO activist and they would like to speak with him regarding his hypnosis session. Hopkins agreed to this meeting and he hung up the phone. Now remember, this is well before cell phones were a thing and there was no payphone in the immediate area. Yet, seconds after hanging up the phone, he looked out his front door window to see a man walking up his front step. He thought this was kind of weird that the men would show up so incredibly quickly, but he opened the door for him and invited him to come in and have a seat.
Weird. This man was later described as wearing a black suit and tie and having no hair on his entire face. No eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair. Which, no judgment, but the guy just had an extraordinary appearance. The good doctor's dog happened to be present in the home as well and immediately went crazy over the visitor, barking and acting totally out of character. The strange man asked Dr. Hopkins a series of questions regarding the hypnosis work that he had done, and then the visitor said something kind of weird. He told Dr. Hopkins that he knew that Dr. Hopkins had 2 coins in his pocket, which was true. He asked Dr. Hopkins if he wouldn't mind removing one of them from his pocket, and Dr. Hopkins did so. He asked Dr. Hopkins to hold the coin in his hand and watch it, and as Dr. Hopkins watched the coin in front of him, a penny turned from a copper bronze color to a very shiny silver right before his eyes. If that isn't strange enough, the coin then began to fade out of view and then right out of Dr. Hopkins' palm. It was gone, disappeared right in front of him. The visitor said that the coin would never be seen on this plane again. Okay.
The visitor's questions weren't finished, though. He asked the doctor if he knew anything about Betty or Barney Hill.
Oh, shit.
If you aren't familiar with Betty and Barney Hill, you totally should be.
Please refer to our episode called I'm Not Saying It Was Aliens.
We did an entire episode on them a while back, and it was pretty fascinating business. You should at least look it up. Anyway, Dr. Hopkins told the visitor that he had heard of them, but he had never met them. He told the visitor that he thought Barney had recently died. The visitor told Dr. Hopkins that this was true. Barney had recently died because Barney no longer had a heart, just like the doctor no longer had a coin.
The visitor then told the doctor that he should probably destroy any documentation regarding his hypnosis work and the UFO abductee, and Hopkins promptly complied.
I think I would also.
I concur.
Actually, I would probably get killed because I would just hide it and pretend that I destroyed it. I'd put it in a time capsule.
I'd get my Sharpie and draw my eyebrows so fast.
Yeah.
Angry brows.
It seems like these mysterious men in black always seem to make their visits after someone has witnessed a UFO incident, or often after abductions, if the subject of the abduction starts talking too much. Their job seems to be only to threaten and silence people as much as they can. Like the extraterrestrials come in and do their thing, whatever that may be.
Stealing our buttholes.
And then the men in black are kind of the cleanup crew, trying to keep it on the DL as much as possible. They use intimidation factors, but they are also reported to communicate partially with telepathy, which is pretty useful intimidation factor in itself. I know that if someone was legitimately getting into my mind and seemed like they were reading my thoughts and threatening me using their magic powers, it would make me wonder what else they could do inside my mind, and I would probably not mess with them either. They're most often described as being officially dressed, and they usually show up in a group of about 2 to 3, but sometimes there will be just one.
A description like that would initially make me think that this group was a government entity, but then many people also describe these men as having other features like glowing eyes, super pale skin, and no hair on their entire bodies, including eyebrows and eyelashes. How do they know, though, about the rest of the body?
They just talk about their heads, Samantha.
Take your suit off.
I want to see the rest.
Let's see.
Yeah, what you got going on?
Shake it.
Don't shake it.
Don't do that. They're also described as not being able to correctly speak or seeming to use inappropriate language like us. Kind of like black-eyed children that we discussed in an earlier episode. Not great social skills, also like us.
These are surprisingly similar to these people.
People seem to get a weird vibe from these men immediately and often report a strong sense of dread just from being around them. To be fair. Also, similar to the black-eyed children stories, people will often report feeling drained of energy after an encounter with them, along with nausea, vertigo, and even temporary amnesia.
One time I was at a party and this guy told me that he didn't want to end up alone with me because he felt like I was the type of girl that would tie him up in his basement.
Once again, to be fair.
It really hurt my feelings. Now I will tie you up in your basement. Say you're sorry.
This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't brought it up.
You gave me this idea. This is your fault.
Victim blamer.
Okay. In 1966, UFO investigator and author John Keel had an experience of his own. He was a full-time UFO investigator, and he was only about a year into his job when, by John's own account, the following incident took place.
First of all, can I ask how one comes by a job as a full-time UFO investigator, and how much does it pay because I'm coming?
I want to apply. These types of jobs are not fairly posted.
No.
So that everyone can see them.
You're not equal opportunity employers?
I want one of those emails.
Me too.
Okay. So anyway, he was a full-time UFO investigator, and he says about his incident, quote, "My telephone rang."
My telephone? Where's my telephone? Sorry.
Shut up.
It struck me funny.
It was. I was really hoping you wouldn't catch it, but you did. Start over.
You used to call me on my telephone.
Stop. Okay, so my telephone ran amok first, with mysterious strangers calling day and night to deliver bizarre messages from the space people. Then I catapulted into the dreamlike fantasy of demonology. I kept rendezvous with black Cadillacs on Long Island, and when I tried to pursue them, they would disappear impossibly on dead-end roads. Throughout 1967, I was called out into the middle of the night to go on silly wild goose chases to try to effect rescues of troubled contactees. Luminous aerial objects seemed to know exactly where I was going and where I had been. I would check into a motel at random, only to find that someone had made reservations in my name and even left a string of nonsense messages for me. I was plagued by impossible coincidences, and some of my closest friends in New York, none of whom were conversant with the phenomenon, began reporting strange experiences of their own. Poltergeists erupted in their apartments, ugly smells of hydrogen sulfide haunted them. One girl suffered an inexplicable 2-hour mental blackout while she was sitting under a hairdryer. More than once I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself unable to move, with dark apparitions standing over me.
Now, we know that this isn't the typical Men in Black report, but we wanted to include it because John Keel is a pretty renowned guy in this field, and it has been speculated that the mischievous Men in Black would be responsible for such things.
In 1967, there was another incident involving a man named Robert Richardson. Supposedly, Richardson was driving down a country road at night when he went around a bend, and out of nowhere, there was something in the road, and Richardson struck it with his vehicle.
One would.
Yeah, he had a car crash with a UFO. Oops.
That's something I would do. I just back right into it. I have this thing where I, back into things quite frequently.
There is that.
Single-handedly keeping the taillight companies afloat.
Right. So he did have time to slow down a bit, but not to avoid the hovering object because it was blocking the entire road. So swerving out of its way doesn't sound like it was much of an option. Richardson said that as soon as he and the object collided, the object disappeared, but it left behind a chunk of metal in the road. Richardson thought for sure this thing hovering super low over the road was a UFO. He kept the chunk of metal that he had found after the crash and sent it to an organization called the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization to see if they could test the metal to see what it was.
Richardson made a police report regarding the incident, and the police seemed to have visited the area to see if they could get a clear idea of what had happened. They did find Richardson's skid marks in the road, but that's about it. No evidence of another vehicle.
So like we said, he sent the chunk of metal that he had found off to Arpo. That move is what got the ball rolling. Soon after he sent the piece of metal off in the mail, 2 men dressed in all black showed up on his doorstep. They were noted to look very authoritative, although Richardson didn't ask them for any credentials, they didn't offer him any either. It was somewhat strange that these men would show up because Richardson claimed that he hadn't even told anyone about the incident aside from his wife and Arpo, but maybe they were sent by Arpo. It was reported that the black car that the men arrived in was brand spanking new and had no license plates.
From the story we read, it sounds like the men got right to the point. They quickly began asking about the chunk of metal that Richardson had found after the incident. They wanted him to hand it over. Richardson told them that he didn't have it anymore and that he had sent the piece of metal away to be tested so they could see what it was. They did not seem pleased with this and told him staunchly that he had better work hard on getting that piece of metal back from whoever he sent it to, and that they would be back to collect it.
We'll be back.
They also told him that if he valued his wife's pretty face, he would do what they asked. Yikes.
What's in the box?
What's in the box?
Yeah. Sure enough, a few weeks later, a couple more weird men arrived at Richardson's place to talk to him. They were not the same guys that were there before, as Richardson had described them as foreign. I'm not sure why he thought they were foreign, but we have read in a lot of other stories that they're typically described as having olive-colored skin, which is kind of neat because that was often how the black-eyed children would have been described, and a lot of people theorize that the men in black and the black-eyed children appear to be in collusion, or at least cooperative with one another as they are sometimes spotted together. Anyway, Richardson said that he never did get that piece of metal back, and he never did hand it over to the men in black, but he never heard from them again, and his wife was never bothered.
That's one common factor that I've noted about many of these stories. Unless there are people who were harmed and have not come forward, it seems like the threatening nature of the authority figures that are the men in black is nothing but talk. All bark, no bite.
Big talkers.
They don't seem to ever really follow through with the threats that they dole out. They do some talking and get what they can from people by threatening them in the moment, but never come back to do the dirty work. Don't make me do your dirty work for you, girl.
In 1968, a UFO researcher named Jack Robinson got a little visit from the Men in Black as well. They spent the better part of 3 days harassing Robinson and his wife. They would stand across the street staring at their home when the couple would leave for the day. They would return and notice that their things had been gone through, even their trash. A neighbor even took a photo of one of the men standing by a storefront, seeming to stare across the street. This photo can easily be viewed online. So he just stood across the street and mean mugged them mostly.
A pretty recent encounter, and one that I find pretty interesting, given the fact that there is security footage of the strange men in question, is that of Shane Sovar. This one happened in 2008. Sovar was the manager of a Niagara Falls hotel, and one night he and one of the hotel's security guards witnessed a UFO. A couple of weeks after the UFO sighting, hotel staff were alarmed by a couple of super weird guys who came into the hotel lobby asking to speak with Sovar and the other hotel staff member who saw the UFO.
When Sovar returned to work, he was immediately told about the visitors who had been there looking for him. This definitely piqued his interest because he went to the security room of the hotel and looked back through the camera footage to see if he recognized them. The men were seen to be wearing black suits and hats, and sure enough, there is video of them coming into the lobby. So at least this story can be backed up somewhat with that. Granted, and within reason, people have obviously speculated that these two men could have been anyone, which is true, but it's still interesting just in case it's not anyone and it's a secret extraterrestrial organization designed to keep the human race under a rock about extraterrestrial activities on our planet, but I digress. The hotel staff who did speak with the men reported to have had no hair on their heads at all, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, nothing. They were weird looking.
Remember the article that we mentioned earlier? The one that was written for the Journal of American Folklore? Folklore.
Damn it, Mick.
One of the most interesting takes on this whole phenomenon, in our opinion anyway, was that of author Peter Reutzvik. Peter had a PhD and was a professor of folklore. He was sitting in the university library in November of 1980 on a particularly rainy day late in the afternoon and had been flipping through a book that was recommended to him by one of his colleagues. This book was about UFOs, and it sounds like Reutzvik felt obligated to check it out, even though he admittedly wasn't really all that interested in UFOs. According to his own account of the incident, he was, quote, sitting alone in a wing facing a large window to the south and stacks of books to my right running for some 6 rows behind me. I had the table closest to the window, facing the window. Strangely, he looked up, and standing directly in front of him at the same table was a strange-looking man wearing a black suit and hat. He spent the better part of 3 seconds staring at the professor before he sat down in the chair across from him and very mechanically straight and very affected.
That's how Reutzvik described the man as he sat down. He sat down very mechanically straight and very affected. So he had strange movements as well.
It was strange because the professor hadn't even heard the man approach initially. And bitty sneaky.
Reutzvik went on to describe the man's physical appearance. Quote, he had a dark complexion, but he was not Oriental or Indian, but dark. He had black hair with something of that greasy look, looking somewhat punk by today's standards. He was very thin with a chiseled nose and chin. He had sunken eyes. The man wore a black suit that needed ironing and possibly cleaning. He had on a white shirt and a black Texan-like string tie. Later, when he rose to leave, I remember noting that his suit was much too large for him, despite him being over 6 feet as I estimated it.
The man was inquisitive, asking Reutzvik a bunch of questions about if he was interested in what the book had to say or if the professor had ever seen a UFO himself. The professor told the odd man that he actually wasn't at all interested, but he had felt compelled to at least look at the book since it had been recommended to him out of politeness. The odd man became angry about his answer, telling the professor staunchly that UFOs are the most important thing of the century. Reutzvik described the interaction, quote, I thought he was going to come unglued. He became highly agitated and said in a voice much too loud for use in a library. I couldn't believe it was happening to me, and I was getting a bit fearful. I was beginning to think that he was more than just a nut. I felt that he might be dangerous. I tried to calm him. Finally, he stood up, not like you or I would, but as if he were mechanically lifted. He was real awkward. Placing his hand on my shoulder, he said something like, "Go well on your purpose," and then the man abruptly walked away. Okay.
The professor was a bit unnerved by this, and he decided that it was time for him to leave as well. But when he got up to do so, he noticed something really odd. There was literally no one else in the library. There had been people there before, but now there were zero. Nobody. No readers, no book checker-outers, no librarian. The place was eerily still and quiet. He was too afraid to keep walking toward the door, so he went back to his seat and waited for about an hour. He got up to leave again, and there they all were, all the people, right back in their places as they had been before.
So obviously we've considered the fact that this is actually a government agency of human people who are sent to quell information regarding UFO and extraterrestrial activity that the government can't necessarily control, but doesn't necessarily want everyone to be aware of. There's also the theory that Men in Black aren't even from Earth, that they themselves are extraterrestrial, and they are somewhat of a strong-arm presence for humans who happen to encounter or interact with extraterrestrials to keep their mouths shut about it. But we also read another theory that we hadn't really heard before and thought it was kind of interesting.
One person suggested that the Men in Black weren't necessarily real at all. Have you ever heard of a tulpa? Well, just in case you haven't, we'll go ahead and try to explain it the best we can. Basically, a tulpa is a life form or energy form of some sort that is invented into existence by a person or group of people. Someone or someones think about this life form that they want to create, and they focus on it using their entire mind and devoting all of their energy into it until their focused thoughts and energy take on a life of its own, creating the thing that they intended. Now, there are some scary stories out there about tulpas having been creative and this practice going awry, but that's not what we're talking about today.
So this theory basically states that during the World War II era and the period following, which would have been the Cold War, suspicions were at serious heights with people about their government. The UFO sightings were in full swing, and the idea that we, as Americans, accidentally created these entities from our collective distrust of Big Brother, and now they're real. You did this. I'm not really entirely sure how I feel about that theory, but we felt it was worth mentioning and very interesting to think about.
Human fear in the flesh. We're going to go ahead and have to do a part 2 when it comes to this phenomenon. There was way too much to be put into one episode here, and we decided that it was best to stick with the basics for this one, introducing you guys to the concept of the phenomenon and the sightings along with what their intentions could be. But as always, there are deeper aspects here, and we would love to continue to talk about them further in the next episode now that we've covered some of the more well-known and somewhat more credible aspects to the stories. But there are many, many more stories to dive into next week, and additional theories here as well. We appreciate you stopping by to listen to us, and we hope that you will again, because there is no shortage of weird and mysterious to be found here, and we love talking about it.
Don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from, and definitely leave us a rating and review, because we love hearing from you guys, and we love to know how we're doing with the show, what you like about it, and what you think we can change. We honestly do consider any feedback you guys shoot our way, and have made a few important changes based on your opinions, so believe us, we appreciate it. If you wish to contact us for any reason, you can do so on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also send us an email at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, or you can call us, which is super fun and super awkward. No, it's not, because all you have to do is leave a voicemail, and we will play that on the next episode. Also, you can text us at that same number, and the number is 641-812-2635. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Adios.
Part deuce. Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper. Yep. I was really screwing that up.
Come at me, bro.